I'm really glad that bookstores are starting to have in-person events again, because if you support RJ Julia or other independent bookstores, you know how important they are to the community, as are all small businesses, and what a toll COVID has taken on all of them. So I also want to say, if you came here to meet Anthony Mara, who was my conversation partner, unfortunately he has COVID right now. So he's not here, but I wanted to say, these are two of his books. He has another book apparently coming out in September. He's a award-winning, best-selling author. I was very excited that he was doing the conversation with me, but he did this really thoughtful thing. So he not only did he read the book and prepare, he sent me the questions he was going to ask, and I read them. And my book just came out on Tuesday, so I haven't been in a lot of conversations, but I did interviews before, and these are some of the most thoughtful questions, and questions I've never been asked. I won't do all of them, but I'm going to touch on some of the questions he was going to ask. It's almost as if he were here, and I am really hoping he feels better soon. I think you know, I don't think he's very, very ill, but certainly he did the right thing by not coming. So I am the author of the book, The Foundling. It's a novel. I've written for, she read the whole thing. I've written other books. I will tell you, The Foundling is a novel, and in brief, it's about two young women who were actually childhood friends. They were raised in the same orphanage in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and they meet as young adults at a kind of a highly acclaimed asylum institution for women. But now they're no longer ward mates. Mary is the secretary to the extremely dynamic and charismatic female doctor who runs the place. And Lillian is an inmate at what is actually a eugenics asylum. Does everyone know what eugenics, or have a familiarity with eugenics? Okay, if you don't, you're like most people, and I didn't know anything. I knew very little about it because we weren't taught about it. We weren't taught in school growing up, and but I think people are more aware now. But in brief, eugenics was a very popular progressive movement in the early 20th century. It was very widespread and it was like a household word. So it's hard for people now to understand that, since most of us have never heard of it. It was a very short-lived movement for reasons that we'll go into later. But anyway, I didn't know much about it, but the way I came to write this book was I was writing another novel, and I joined Ancestry.com, and I, like maybe some of you, became obsessed, and to this day I probably go on once a day. I love genealogy research. And anyway, early on I just really wanted to know what I thought would be a really simple thing to find out, which is I knew my maternal grandmother grew up an orphan, and I wanted to see like what orphanage she grew up in, and why she had no parent, what happened to her parents. I still don't know the answer to either of those questions. It's a lot of orphan records are not, they were like a lot of institutional records were either flood or fire, they were purged somehow. I know anecdotally that it was a Catholic orphanage because she was born with the name Elma and into a Presbyterian family, and she then went by Mary for the rest of her life because the nuns changed her name to a saint's name, and they converted her to Catholicism, but then afterwards I don't think she carried on in the Catholic faith. Anyway, that's all I knew. I couldn't find Mary Rauschmeyer, my grandmother's birth certificate. I couldn't find her orphanage. I found her at age 17 in 1930, working at a place in central Pennsylvania called the Laurelton State Village for Feeble-Minded Women. That was on the top of the census record. And I thought, that's very nice. And then I looked, and it was page after page were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people. And I thought she was a patient there, but she was one of the very small number of employees. She was actually a stenographer. She worked for the superintendent who ran the place, who was a very dynamic female doctor in the 1920s, early 20th century. Anyway, I realized it's probably a home that helps people with intellectual disabilities. It was not the nicest word. I soon learned that the term or the word feeble-minded as well as idiot, imbecile, and moron were clinical terms used by doctors before they became slurs. So even though now we think it's awful, at the time they were just, so an idiot was the lowest kind of IQ, and then imbecile was medium. The term moron was actually a word that was coined by a pioneer of American eugenics, a man named Henry H. Goddard. And moron referred to what they called the highest functioning and most dangerous of the feeble-minded people, because they look normal, and in the case of women, they were often quite pretty until later you found them kind of ruined and destitute with the fatherless child begging on the streets. But moron meant morally defective. So they were mentally defective or morally. So that's where the moron thing came in. And once you were able to add this higher level of intellectual disability, basically it was easy to assign it to a very broad range of people. And actually a doctor who worked in the asylum where my grandmother worked wrote a book that was a pamphlet or something that was published, I think, just for people in the public health system in the United States, but it was about feeble-minded women. And she had listed all these traits that were indicators that a young woman was feeble-minded. And when I told my husband, well, so here were some: drinking, actively seeking sex, boisterous behavior, incorrigible, attitude, lack of respect for parents. I told my husband, he said, so basically you when I met you. Everyone in college, everyone I knew, me and all my friends. So yeah, it was shocking to me that, it wasn't that they, and certainly there were also, there were at the place where my grandmother worked and at the place in my book, which was based on that, a very small percentage of and they called them inmates in those days, or the residents were truly disabled. They were about 10%, I think, when my grandmother was working there, is a figure I saw. And but most of them were delinquent girls. In fact, the newspapers the local newspapers would go back and forth between a home for feeble-minded women, a home for delinquent girls. But what I found out very soon after I saw the census record, that wasn't even the whole name. It wasn't just the Laurelton State Village for feeble-minded women. The actual name, they just couldn't fit it on the top of that page. Like the word feeble-minded women kind of came off the line. The official name was the Laurelton State Village for feeble-minded women of childbearing age. And the of childbearing age part of it was actually the more, kind of from my perspective, and probably from most people today's perspective, the more offensive of the words or the terms in the long name of the place, because this wasn't an asylum where young women were sent to get therapy or help or being taught, skills. It was a warehouse for, again, delinquent girls, more morally defective girls, and some were sent, by a board husband. I was shocked to see there were 12 and 13-year-old girls. You might be sent there if you were an orphan and you might have had a learning issue. They didn't understand processing disorders or learning issues. So if the orphan asylum, as they called them those days, thought the girl was slow, she'd be sent there. But some girls were sent there because she said her uncle, who was a prominent member of the community, was touching her inappropriately. Well, she's not, something's wrong with her. So there were so many sad things I found out about why women are sent there. But the saddest thing was it wasn't like if you were arrested for prostitution in Pennsylvania in the 1920s, there was a 1-year sentence for that, and you would be released. But while you were in Muncie prison, for example, which was a women's prison that was like a feeder prison to this place where my grandmother worked, if the warden there thought you might be slow or might be actually useful to the asylum, because the asylum was kind of like work farms, if they decided you were actually feeble-minded, you didn't get to leave after a year. You were sent to this home for feeble-minded women of childbearing age, and you got to leave when you reach menopause. So a 12-year-old would be there for a long time. Back to the story. So that's the background. My novel, I became obsessed. I researched for years. I finished the novel I was writing, which was my last novel, The Children, the minute I handed in my final draft, and it was the middle of winter. I didn't care. I got my car, I left New York State and drove to first Scranton, and then Laurelton, Pennsylvania, where this place was, and then to Harrisburg. And I went back to Pennsylvania several times over the years of researching this to find records to. I wanted to see county records and state records and I wanted to, in today's research world, you don't need to leave your bed really. And I found a lot of information in newspaper archives. So I found this doctor who ran the place where my grandmother worked, gave speeches all over Pennsylvania. She published things, but I had to go and be there. I wanted to see the area, and I'm so glad I did. It really gave me a sense of the institution, what it felt like, and anyway, it helped, very much helped inform me. So early on, I thought I might write a kind of a nonfiction long article or a short book about my journey of discovery, about what really happened. But I soon realized I really had a kind of a novel came to me, because these really three characters kept coming to me. And one was, of course, my grandmother. And the main character in my book is named Mary, after my grandmother. And she's the narrator. And she does go to work for this doctor. Dr. Vogel in my book, really, I really modeled her after a real woman who was named Dr. Mary Wolfe, who was the superintendent of the real place. When I first learned about Dr. Wolfe, I was really blown away and in awe of her. She went to medical school in 1899 when very few women went to college even. She was one of the first female psychiatrists in the United States. She was a suffragist before that. She and her mother and grandmother had been before that. She came from a very politically connected, wealthy Pennsylvania family. And she was amazing. The things she wrote, she had humor, she had wit, she was smart, she proved, early on I was reading that all these articles kind of praising her. I didn't know her brother published the newspaper. There was, anyway, so, but she was able to prove that a female-only asylum could be just as self-sufficient, and that was really important in those days. Prisoners had to kind of pay the state back for being there. That's why they had chain gangs. That was and I didn't know this, but inmates in institutions too, in the early 20th century, they were kind of blamed. Like it was like, especially when this whole eugenics, I think I still haven't explained eugenics, but when there came this thing where it was like, the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania is taking care of you. You owe Pennsylvania. You have to work and work hard here, and the girls would be farmed off to work in local homes and sometimes in mills. And so I'm getting a little off track here. Did I explain what eugenics is? Okay. So eugenics was this really easy to grasp science, they called it a science, which was really, it was social Darwinism. It was this idea that the world could be made better if better people had more children and inferior people had less children. So you might have not known certain things you've heard about were related to eugenics. So there were these better baby contests in the early 20th century. And like they would have at state fairs, you bring your baby, your white baby, and these beautiful babies, and they would judge them based on how they looked. And that was a eugenics kind of fun, like cultural thing. But on a more academic level, there were these widely published scholars, doctors, scientists, and there were also just luminaries in our society that really embraced eugenics. Theodore Roosevelt, Virginia Woolf, H.G. Wells. I could go on and on. Many people that we really respect. Margaret Sanger in recent years has come under a lot of attack because people found out she really was a eugenicist, and she was. But the thing that people don't get is that in that time, that was, so were all of many of your favorite. I mean, I wish I had the list here. So many people. It wasn't. It was it wasn't considered evil yet, because it hadn't become abuse. It still was like there were positive eugenics and negative eugenics. So positive eugenics would be just like Margaret Sanger was really of the idea that kind of wealthy and educated women knew how to prevent conceiving a child because of the rhythm method. They had education, and Margaret Sanger was like rolling up her sleeves. She was in the tenements, and she was seeing the suffering of women who didn't know much about biology or the reproductive system. And so really her intentions were very good, but she has written, there's an author's note at the beginning of my book where she says, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing, but girls of feeble-minded women should be segregated from society, because if they are not, they are bound to have children who will be surely be imbeciles or idiots. Like in a book in 1924. She also had attitudes about race that were very common in those days, that are abhorrent today. And so she's received a lot of anger, and in our culture where you can only, there's no gray area for it. You're either good or bad. It's like, so there's no room for putting people into context. So anyway, back to the novel. But that's sort of something that I struggled with in writing it. Was I decided I wanted to tell it from the point of view of the young woman, based on my grandmother, who goes to work at this place. And I really did, because I wanted to explore, I've always wondered, as many people have, how did so many Germans buy into the Nazi thought thing, or how do they buy into it? How does an average person fall, kind of get caught up in a very corrupt and actually evil thing? And so I read a lot of books, and there were a few books written by people who, after the war, told their experience, and still like, still not. But it was also at a time I wrote this and researched this across a couple of administrations. So all these headlines that were coming out while I was writing this were headlines I was reading in newspaper archives almost exactly. A very important part of the eugenics movement was immigration. And a really big part of the problem with women at that time was industrialization of our country. So women were now coming out of, people were coming off the farms and into the cities, and people were poor, and so women were kind of considered very vulnerable and needing to be taken care of, because women kind of had the status of children in those days, and I'll get into that later. I always loved the 1920s. I had a very different idea. This is set in 1927. I always thought of the 20s as the roaring 20s, like jazz age and flappers and drinking, and Zelda Fitzgerald and Daisy Buchanan. Those were the rich ladies of the 1920s. If you were wealthy and in the 1920s, you could drink or have a lover that you weren't married to, and you could do a lot of things and be considered, think of the Dorothy Parker characters in her stories. You could be what a fun gal. But if you were poor, you were really considered a menace to society, because who would take care of your what if they didn't have access to, they couldn't fly to Paris and get an abortion. But also not just that they didn't have any, we didn't have the social support that for people that we did now. So anyway, I was shocked by the sadness of, just the roaring 20s, kind of the roar went away for me the more I researched it. But what I did was I had Mary who grew up in an orphanage, had no family, no money, but like my grandmother, apparently in the orphanage, they gave her skill. They taught her a trade, which they did. I think according to census records, she went to, she had like a 9th grade education, but then instead of teaching her algebra, they taught her stenography and shorthand. She became a secretary, which is, would have been a smart thing to do. And so somehow she got this job, my real grandmother, and the same thing in the story with the main character. But then my struggle was how to have the reader, you know, not be, you know, put off by her going off to work at this place that she knows is, you know, is a eugenics asylum. So anyway, I had a lot of, I went through a lot of drafts of this book. I've worked longer on this book than anything. I had a lot of early reads. I had an agent whose assistant had just graduated from NYU, and she was unmoored and triggered, and she wanted Mary to be a revolutionary, and like, why would she join? She thought this was like the eugenics movement was like a hate group, maybe like the Ku Klux Klan, and that this hospital maybe was a culty thing. And I realized I had been researching it for so long, I had forgotten that no one you know, I couldn't expect the reader to just I couldn't plunge the reader in and have them, you know, like these people that were doing this. So I did add an author's note, and in the author's note, I did explain, you know, there's words that are really offensive, you know, as I explained to you, idiot, imbecile, moron, definitely attitudes about race were actually, they did have dog whistles, but the stuff that is dog whistle today, that were headlines in those days. They were openly what many people today would call racist. And certainly Mary shared her very sheltered cultural attitudes about race. And why would she question eugenics or even, you know, our culture's attitude about race when the president at the time, Calvin Coolidge, who was considered quite, you know, very progressive when it came to race relations, he signed into law the Immigration Act of 1924, which is also known as I always forget this. It had to do with it had to do with preventing certain races. So basically, it was called I'm going to get it before the end of the thing. I'm having a senior moment, but they put quotas on where people could come from, and so before that you could come, and then you know, if you were feeble-minded or something, you might be sent back if you had TB or something. They basically put all these quotas if you came, because people were coming from Eastern and Southern Europe and Asia and Africa, and people wanted people that looked like Calvin Coolidge. You know, the 1924 Immigration Act basically said you can come if you look like Calvin Coolidge and these senators who wrote this act, but otherwise, you know, stay home, because they were worried about America's racial, you know, purity, or kind of, you know, what they called like race, you know, it's like identity, which was very white, and by white they meant Nordic, they meant Northern and Western European. And I found out through research that there were people that were considered off-white, which could have even been Irish people, but certainly, you know, people from Italy or Greece or the Mediterranean countries, you know, they were varying levels of white. And anyway, that so there were many things that were there were federal laws that were about eugenics. So it was the culture. It was not. You know, it wasn't, it was hard for me I had to find a way for the young people like the early reader to understand, because she was angry that why would she be so naive about this awful thing? And it was like, no, she wasn't naive. I was naive when I first came into this. And I actually thought too, like, why would she work there? I was very naive about what the culture was like then. But you know, now I know a little bit more about it. Okay, I'm gonna just read one or two things that Anthony Mara would have asked if we were here. And one was, no one asked this, but okay, so Lillian, Mary is the person who worked there. Lillian is her friend, childhood friend. She actually is an inmate. The reason she was sent there is because she worked at a kind of a shady speakeasy in Scranton and was a jazz singer there. And she met a Black musician who she fell in love with. And unfortunately, she got pregnant. When she had his baby, it was apparent that she had a Black consensual relationship with a Black man, that would immediately label her feeble-minded, because the person with a normal mind wouldn't have a sexual relationship with a person of an inferior race, as they said openly in the newspapers in those days. So she was sent there. Her daughter was taken from her, and that's where the kind of the story begins. Mary's got this great job. She loves it. She's got friends. They go out on their weekends, and she meets boys, and they have fun. It's their own speakeasy. And then she meets Lillian, her childhood friend, who's stuck there. And so her kind of dilemma is, does Lillian belong here? Because she's bought into this whole thing, something's wrong with Lillian. Like, she seemed so smart when we were growing up, but she always was, she was always she was always, the nuns were always mad because she was obstinate. And now Mary's learning, like, that's a sign. So it's like, so I had Mary kind of bring the reader in the way I was. Like, she comes in and learns the way I did about the ideology of the time. And Mary buys into it. Why wouldn't she? Again, it was, why would she think she's smarter than this amazing doctor who is running the place? Dr. Vogel is my favorite character in the book. She's very much like the real doctor who ran the place. She's not only very intelligent, she had a very witty and wonderful way of giving speeches. And she was, in the novel, she was very beautiful. And she was never married, and her father was dead. So as that, being a woman of 40 and having no husband or father, she had more agency than most women would ever expect to have in the early 20th century. So maybe people know that when you, in those days, when you married, your husband became your guardian. And so even if you're wealthy, if you came to a family with a lot of money and your husband was less wealthy, then he had the bank account, the money was his. It was a term called coverture. I'd never heard of before. If you divorced, he would get the children unless you could prove he was abusive. Anyway, if you were not married, your father was your guardian. So I started to really understand Margaret Sanger and others like her even more, because Margaret Sanger, don't forget, was also a suffragist. So the Dr. Vogel in the book, she was a suffragist, women's rights, really was a proponent of protecting women. And she really wouldn't hire men to work there. She wanted to protect the women. Some of these women had been truly victimized as children. And the main character, Mary, we find out, had some sexual trauma growing up. Anyway, I thought about, how do I make people not hate? I didn't want her to be a monster. I didn't want her to be Nurse Ratched. It's just, I didn't want her to be that kind of like, stereotypical ward matron. But when I started reading about what it was like for women in those times, so while the real doctor, and I wrote it into the book, so we'll just say Dr. Vogel from the book, after she had become a doctor and a psychiatrist and was running a very successful, actually a profitable institution for women, she started the place in like 1909 or something. So while she was running it, she couldn't vote. She was writing health report, I guess dossier isn't the word, but she was writing, she was tasked to write health kind of, what's the word, when you get to give to Congress, to give to elected officials to help them create laws for our public health and make decisions. She was advising them, yet she couldn't vote for them. But the guy who dug the road to her institution went off and vote. So right, so I suddenly thought, oh, okay, so because in the novel, and I'm not going to tell too much because I don't want to give spoilers. You start to wonder if Dr. Vogel isn't a little bit corrupt. She's doing some good things, but she might be also a little bit corrupt beyond being a proponent of eugenics, which, so I kind of got this idea of why would, I would be angry, if I imagine. So, but it also answered, like, why is she never married? She, her husband would be her legal guardian, even though she was a doctor. So one of the questions Anthony was going to ask was, so Lillian's last name is Faust. And have you know what a Faustian bargain is? Do you know the term Faustian bargain? So it's a kind of, you make a deal with the devil. It's basically you make a deal where you'll get, the amazing earthly wealth and then the payoff is the devil gets your soul for eternity. I guess, it's like an old German kind of folk tale that's been told many times. The most recent people know would think of it's like Rosemary's Baby would be like a Faustian bargain. So when I was looking through this list of people, all the women, really, I was obsessed with the census records of the women. And I came across, and newspaper articles, I came across a real patient inmate there named Marie Faust. And I was aware of her because her mother tried to get her out and actually got a lawyer. And don't forget, most of the people that were most of the girls here came from very poor families in, rural part of Pennsylvania. And her family, they hired a lawyer and did a habeas corpus, tried to do a habeas corpus case. And they lost, as if everyone else who tried to get there. And not a lot of people tried, but a few mothers really did try to get their girls out. And Marie Faust was a famous case, was all of the newspapers. And so I loved it because I thought, that Faust has a great kind of, it is, I guess it was kind of a common German name, but it kind of works with the Faustian bargain thing. So he asked, so that's why I named Lillian Faust, I just because of that. So he asked something about that, and I'm not going to find it. Okay. Well, he asked why, where in the novel, why, okay. Why didn't I mark it? Lillian was dropped off at St. Cat's by a doctor named Faust, from whom Lillian receives her surname. Can you discuss how Faustian bargains play? I just did that. But yeah, so that's why I didn't name it. It was inspired by a real patient, but I did know the irony or the kind of way it worked. I kind of loved the name because of that. He asked about the parallels between what I was writing, what was happening in the novel, and the headlines I was reading while I was doing the research of the novel, and the parallels with the headlines I was reading while I was writing it. So don't forget, I finished the book kind of almost a year ago. But during the years I was writing it, we had so many things. Immigration especially was such a big thing, and it was really openly. It wasn't. Actually, again, it was again for years. It was just this open, really despising the people who didn't belong here, who didn't look like us, and they weren't. Honestly, that's what was almost. It was almost the same words. They're not sending their best people. They're sending, their worst people. And they had very rudimentary IQ tests at that time. And they were basically, again, they had questions that I think one of the questions involved like a golf term. Like it was really like, unless you went to Yale, or you had to be really white. Like you really had to be white so they were very, people trusted doctors. People were less educated than they are now. People read less. They worked harder. I mean, there's so many things that like made this work. What I really want readers to know is it's strange that we don't know about it now because it was so widespread then. If you want to know about it and have it explained much more clearly than I just did, PBS, the American Experience, that series did one of their episodes was called The Eugenics Crusade. And I recently rewatched it because I was worried about like, how did they use idiot, imbecile, moron? They used it throughout. They did the same thing. Like, this is what they said, because I didn't know if people would be upset with it's hard to say these words. And so anyway, it's a wonderful special, and it really explains exactly how popular it was and why and how short-lived it was. And the reason was because guess who really admired the American and Britain and Canada's eugenics movement? Adolf Hitler. It was in Mein Kampf. While he was in prison, he was reading books written by our eugenics scientists. And then after the war, we learned what the final solution to eugenics, is because originally he just wanted to sterilize. By the way, in some states, they sterilized the unfit. Many states, like Pennsylvania, couldn't pass laws that allowed that, so they would just segregate and lock them up. Anyway, he was originally just going to segregate and sterilize the unfit. The first the first population that were euthanized were the mentally disabled, the feeble-minded. So I think that what happened, it's like it didn't just kind of fade away. It just came to a screeching halt. It was just something that my mother said her grandmother never told her she worked at a place like that. She said she worked for the government. She met my grandfather, who was a student at Bucknell, which was, in a neighboring town,
Right.
and she worked for the government. And that was it. I'm sure at the time, though, I know at the time, because I saw on a record in a newspaper announcement that she proudly said she worked at this place. So anyway, that's why I think we don't know about it. It's something, it's not something, it's one of those hidden bits of history that, it's over. It's like, look away. But many of the kind of, what's the word, I'm sorry, I've been talking about this nonstop for 2 weeks, but traces of it are everywhere in our culture today. They really are. There still are immigration laws that involve, who can come from where, and there still are very the testing of children, to get into schools, and there still are kind of this classifying people, but mostly it is this who is an American, who deserves to be American, who doesn't deserve to be American, what do Americans look like? That was really the kind of like the soul of the eugenics movement in America. There was a eugenics movement in Great Britain too. I will close, and then is it almost time to go to questions?
Yeah.
So I will close by saying, the place where my grandmother worked went through reforms, as many of these places did. It became a true training school for people with intellectual disabilities. Reforms went on through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and it closed in the 1990s. I've become conversational friends. I've spoken on the phone, I'm in a Facebook group with people who actually worked there in the 90s. And some of them were quite defensive, especially at the beginning, about the origins of the place. They didn't really, they doubted it was real. They still had to be feeble-minded, even though they were delinquent. But then when I would, send, a lot of them, I don't know why, I felt like my grandmother worked there when it was really awful, and I'm not ashamed. There's no shame, for you. And these people, what really touched me was, these people were so devoted. The people I have spoken to who worked there towards the end, they were so devoted to the individuals, as they called. I once referred to somebody as resident, and they corrected me. No, we call them individuals. And so they very much, they were sad when it closed. It was a beautiful, beautiful. Kind of was built on the cottage plan, so it looked almost like a college campus, but there were bars and windows. It employed many people in that region. It was, again, a very rural country, so people worked there, their parents and grandparents, and now it's falling apart. So it's, it's kind of interesting that I've talked to people about how sad they are at closing. But I did have a conversation with somebody who said something about the purge, because I was like, I went to the archives, there's just so little. And she said, well, when it was closed, we had this purge. And I said, oh, purge? And she said, yeah, we had to destroy documents. But she said, we all kept stuff. And I said, well, what do you have? And she said, well, I have a logbook. She's an older woman now. And she said, it has all the, the foreign delegations that came to tour. And I said, come again? I said, like, where, from where? She said, oh, from Europe. And she said, there was even a group from Japan. And because it was a model, thing. It reminded me of Rosemary's Baby, of when the baby's born and they come from all over to see. But certainly that was, so I said, what are you going to do with that? Like, please. And she said, I'm going to give it to the Lewisburg, Union County, which is Lewisburg Historical Society. And I said, I don't trust them, because I went there and they whitewashed the doctor. Everything was nice. So I hope I'm going to meet her, because next week I'm going to be in Pennsylvania doing events. I'm really looking forward to meeting people. Like, I think we've all come. At first there was this like, what are you writing? And now I think people are like, oh, okay, it's a novel, and I'm interested in, open to, and actually, I feel very respectful of the fact that, I don't want them to feel that I'm kind of tarnishing something that was very a very different place for them. Any questions? Or are you more confused now than when you first bought it?
No. Is the institution still there?
It's there, but it closed in the 1990s, and it's in disrepair. So
Is this the one in Pennsylvania or the one in
Pennsylvania? Yeah, all over though, as you probably know, like Fairfield Hills in Connecticut, like there's beautiful places that are just falling apart. And
we used to live in Massachusetts, and there were, now that you're listening to, and there was right in our town that was. It sounds like a very similar institution, and it was eventually, run by the state, and it evolved over the years into whatever. But
what town was it?
it was Rentham.
Was it the Fernald School?
I think it was close to but no, I know what you mean with Fernald School, but
yeah. So, but it was
there was even like a cemetery. It was very sad. Like our youth league soccer fields were right there, and there was like this, it was so sad, the like little cemetery there.
With known that okay, so I did a talk I did a talk in Cambridge with this Harvard professor named Alex Green, who's doing a biography of Walter E. Fernald. That was his school. It started out actually a much better place. It then became a eugenic. It evolved. So that's the school where they gave the poisoned oatmeal to the kids. They gave the kids like radioactive oatmeal. Maybe you've heard of that. So anyway, that was later, but there was just a different attitude. People, if you were in an and so also prior to the 20th century, people with mental illness, people with schizophrenia, people with psychosis were housed with people who had intellectual disabilities. And then they realized that doesn't make a lot of sense. These are different people, and especially with children, like they really shouldn't be. They used to house them all together. And so, but the thing about being, in a psychiatric institution is you could become better, even though they didn't have great medication in those days. You'd come out of your psychotic episode, where you sometimes go home, but you would not go home once you were labeled feeble-minded, but you would be put to work. And you'd be working in crop fields, you'd be making all the food for the asylum, you'd be milking cows for not just your asylum, or the orphanages surrounding. It was hard work, and it was very sad for the women of that time. I will one more thing I want to say is arguments happened in this Facebook group because people would show up and say, hey, I'm doing genealogy research, and I found out my great aunt was an inmate there, and I never knew she was feeble-minded. And so people would say, oh, man, and I would always say, well, she probably wasn't. And then there'd be this argument, well, how do you know? But I really felt, and I had this quiet, like private message back and forth with the psychologists who were there like in the 80s and 90s. It was a completely different place. But I said, I get where you feel uncomfortable with its origins, but I feel these women were, so horribly stigmatized and shamed while alive. And now it's basically like slut shaming them from beyond the grave. And it's not right. It's like not okay for their, or not even slut shaming them, that they are assigned their great niece or sometimes great granddaughter, because some of them did have children prior to going there. They now think that there was an intellectually disabled person in their family tree, and by today's standards, very few of the women there would have been considered intellectually disabled. But the book's really fun. I do have a feeling people are like, oh, everything's so grim, I can't with this. Mary has fun. She does do a lot of she's an 18-year-old in the 1920s, and I really tried to kind of think, what would I be like if I were, in the 20s, and I was 18. And what really helped me, I think, hopefully make her palatable for the reader is something that I learned. My grandmother ended up very unwell. Am I over the time? Do I need to stop? What time?
No.
Oh, okay. My grandmother, last time I saw her, I was 8, and she lived until I was in my 30s and had children of my own, but she and my mother became estranged. My grandmother was very unwell. She had a very traumatic childhood. And So she and my mother, I never saw her again, but I was so curious, and I would ask my mother questions. My mother would never tell me, just that she was awful. She would go to my mother's wedding. She would go to anybody's thing. She was mean. My mother never liked her. And I said to my mother once, well, what do you think? Once I started presenting my mother with the stuff which she really didn't want to know much about, but I said, well, what do you think was wrong with her though? Because later on she really was unwell, and tried to go. She had lots of sad things happen in her life, in her childhood, and then even as an adult when my mother was alive. And my mother had a very sad childhood as a result. So anyway, I said, what do you think was wrong with her? And my mother said, she thought about it for a minute, and she said, Ann, I get like kind of emotional when I said it, but she said, Ann, nobody ever loved her. No one ever loved her. And I thought, oh, okay, that's so very sad. But then I went through everything I knew, either anecdotally or through research, and the husband who abandoned her and my mother, and everything I'd seen kind of supported that. And that really helped me. And this was when I was still in the research stage, but that really helped me. So I really wrote in, and she certainly is, my mother also told me, I was like, did she have a great sense of humor? Because my mother does. And she said, oh, she's very funny. So I took those two things. Like I made her fun, she was funny and witty and had kind of, but she was, kind of haughty about like the local. She thought she was better because she came from Scranton. All this stuff, all these defenses came from a place of feeling such like profound, deep shame and having I just imagine growing up with actually no understanding of what it would feel like for somebody to love you. That helped me a lot, and I hope people see that in Mary. And I think they have, because I've actually, so there was a lot of editorial pushback, much more than any other novel I've worked on, about Mary. Can she be prettier? Can she be nicer? Can she bring down the whole eugenic thing? And I really didn't want to make her I wanted to really write a person she wasn't woke. How would she be? Like why would we expect her to be? But she does, and she's flawed, but she does ultimately try to do a small thing, and that might help. And whether she succeeds or not, you'll have to find out. But I hope it inspires people to look at their own lives or circumstances, and the way we feel so defeated right now with everything, no matter again which side you're on. We can't fix everything that's wrong, but you might be able to help someone or something, very close to you. And the only other thing I'll say is I was the least of my friends disturbed over politics while this was all going on, because what I was reading, people were like, it's never been worse. Even older people like that, I've been here for alive for 90 years, never been worse. I was like, well, so 100 years ago was actually a little bit worse, especially for women. So really, but there were still things that were, very similar. It's sad that it hasn't changed much. A lot of, sadly, the whole issues regarding race and that stuff. But I found the more I learned about where we've been, the less hopeless I felt, because we've had struggles in our country before. We live in a great country. It was, this whole Make America Great. It was great, and it was, it was great. It wasn't great. It was the best it could be. Then it's trying, everyone wants it to be the best it can be. But I found it hopeful, and I found it, kind of not, I don't know, I found it less depressing the more I learned about where we are now, how we got to where we are now. And I felt one of the pushbacks I had to do was to present a white person who was like white people at the time. So people really want white people to be like Atticus Finch, like a savior. They want them to, you can have other white people be racist, but the protagonist, according to college graduates, who probably, they have to be a person that, is going to save all the people. And I said, I feel like it's not enough to now try to, yes, we want to hear more voices of people of color. We want to hear more stories, but also I think it's time now for white people to write honestly about white people in, historic, how white people were in the past, and be honest about it, and then like we can live with it. It's like, it's not, why, because it's almost like it's just, I feel like it's more racist to, even though it's woke people that want, me to lie about them, they want a person to represent, but I don't feel that that's accurate. I want to represent people the way they were. I don't feel like it, so I'm not saying she was, a racist, but I was very aware of, I wouldn't have her have anachronistic attitudes, because I'm done with, I feel like we're done with that. Like, who were we? What were we like? What are we like now? That's, don't be ashamed. Just that, you don't have to, yeah.
Do you think that these institutions were built like out of fear?
Wait, I can't,
Do you think that they were built out of fear? Because you were saying, like, how could this have happened? And it was a window of time, and then you're comparing it to Germany, and then fears, like, how could that rise up in Germany? The fear of other or whatever. And so this is a fear of people who they considered might be dangerous to their families or something. So let's lock them up, even though the test for whatever was considered feeble-minded was like a ridiculous test of intelligence, but it came out of some place of real fear.
Oh, it was absolutely.
So you're like, well, how could we have that now? And I'm sitting here thinking, and I'm thinking right now we have a fear. We have a fear of shooters. So and mental health. So how are we gonna evaluate somebody's mental health? So that, and are we gonna start locking,
well, what's
the level that we're gonna say, okay, you have a problem, you're dangerous to society?
Well, so certainly that has been something, and I do have, my family has a lot of, and the truth is a lot of psychiatric conditions are hereditary. Alcoholism has a genetic component. So a lot of what they were finding out, stuff, it was, some of it was true, but you sterilize a person, what if he got sober? Because you're not going, but you're right. So when this whole thing of like, we just have to, it's the mentally ill, the stigmatizing of the mentally ill over like just, that is something, that really concerns me, obviously, because of where we've been. But it was very much fear, but it was also, it was seen as this hopeful thing too, that what the fear was that America would become what was happening in like the Lower East Side. All of America would look like these tenements. There would be all these filthy, uneducated people that spoke languages that we didn't understand. Many of them had religions that weren't Christian, and that was terrifying for people. And they actually felt it was, it was danger, it was wrong and dangerous. So yes, they were very afraid of that, and so they felt very righteous about what they were doing. It was all very much about fear, and this was a solution. And a reality. The other thing I found out with Alex Green from Harvard, and I hadn't thought about, was prior to the early 20th century, like in the Victorian late 19th century, there was a much more sympathetic attitude toward people with disabilities, people who were different. But that's because we were more homogeneous in our rate. Most people, there wasn't as many immigrants. But if you think of, say, Dickens characters, orphans, were always noble, and like Tiny Tim in the Christmas Carol, and he said, truly in society, in communities, and this goes on now too, a community, a small town, will have, kind of support the person who has a disability. Certainly in the old days, they'd be a subject of ridicule and maybe called the village idiot, but the community felt a sense of responsibility. And also women who worked kind of in these religious charitable groups really recognized that the environment was causing a lot of the problems to these people. So they wanted to fix the environment. They wanted to make, have healthier, cleaner housing and healthier sanitary conditions. Once the eugenics kind of science came in, the shift turned from let's fix society to all the blame went to, your genetic, your subpar family there were signs like these state fairs in these eugenics that some people were born to be a burden to the rest. So they were considered, they were to blame, not the blame was cast at the feet of the people who were victimized by the whole movement.
Was there a racial component to the people who were, you know, idiots, or do you know what I mean? If they were different, were there more people of, you know, not white?
Yes.
Or
Yeah, so speeches that the doctor gave, so there were all white women in this
But
asylum
less
when my grandmother
white,
worked there,
right.
because everything was so segregated that even if you were a very poor imbecile, if you were white, it would be like indecent to house you with a black person, and it's crazy. So that's how racist we were. So, but much of the doctor's speeches and in the book and the real doctor talked about openly. I mean, it would be reported in the newspaper and not like, you know, how, but it was about the danger. Really, the reason these girls were there is the fear was most of these girls were farm girls, you know, who came from, you know, probably English or Dutch or German ancestry in Pennsylvania, and they were likely to run afoul of a Slav or a Jew or an Italian, and it was openly like in newspapers. These were inferior races. So once that happened, that person just brought our race, you know, lowered that, you know, it's the stock that was used all the time. Stock. It was like the one of the top American eugenicists who started well, I mean, he was like Henry Goddard. He was like one of the pioneers of eugenics. He was also the president of the American Breeders Association. He had prize cattle, and he talked about it all the time. He's like, "Why do we spend? You wouldn't breed your top dairy, you know, the cow who produces the most milk with like or a racehorse with like a plow horse.
Right.
Why are we letting people willy-nilly breed all over the place with anyone they want?" And it just seemed to make sense. But then it's like if you think back of your family, of how maybe your grandmother really worried about, you know, you seeming smart because it was dangerous to, or hiding you know, a minor disability, or, you know, a minor deafness, anything. You know, it was certainly epilepsy would get you put in an institution. So if you think back in your own family, most people will find an orphan because many people, you know, have one or two parents die of diseases in those days. But also they will, if you think back about attitudes of older relatives, you'll think, oh, okay, yeah, they were afraid of that. Unless you were really wealthy, and I don't know why you did it, but anyway.